Welcome to this week's episode of the Caregivers podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Ropeleski. You can call me Dr. Mark. Midlife crisis is one of those things people feel they already know. We joke about it. We fear it. We know the stereotypes: the sports car, the cosmetic overhaul, the new and often younger partner, the sudden reinvention. But beneath the cliche is something more human. At some point in life, time starts to feel different. Mortality moves closer. The old markers of success stop answering the deeper question of whether the life you built still feels like your life. So today, we're not unpacking the stereotype. We're trying to understand what a midlife crisis really is, why it happens, what it makes people do, and how to move through it without blowing up your life. Today's episode, we're welcoming back former guest, goes way back to our first episode, psychotherapist Bev Blaney. She joins us today for an amazing discussion. The easiest way to support the show is to subscribe wherever you listen: YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. It's totally free, and it helps us out tremendously. Plus, it means you never miss an episode. We appreciate you listening, and we appreciate your reviews. Beverly Blaney, welcome back to the Caregivers podcast. I'm so thrilled that you're back with us. I can't believe it's just about 30 episodes ago that you were our first guest, and we look forward to chatting with you today.
Well, thank you for asking me back.
Well, I think we'll jump right into it. And with respect to today's topic, can you tell me a little bit about what starts to change in a person when their midlife crisis begins?
That's assuming there's only one.
Well, it may be serial. Yes, you're correct.
It's hard to say. It isn't like a formula. It's not like a one size fits all. And it would definitely depend on each individual. And, if you're young, it might look one way. As you get older, it can look quite different. But I think what really most people would notice is that things just don't line up anymore. All the things that we use to make sense of our life and like the compass that we'd had, it doesn't feel like it's true anymore. There's a sense of a split between who I was and how I felt and where I am now.
It almost sounds like a feeling of unsettling.
Well, if they talk about crisis, it's like a turning point. It's a period of things being unstable. So, yeah, for sure. It's usually very unsettling for people.
And you bring up a good point, is that it can happen as early as the 30s, or it can happen later in life as well. But tell me, how do you tell the difference between the beginning of a midlife crisis or just going through sort of one of those tough stretches in life? Is it timing, or is there something really distinct that separates a midlife crisis from going through a tough stretch?
I think it can be both. Some people go through several of these, I would call them sort of transition periods in their life. So timing could be one. It is very often brought on by something that really alters the course of their life. You could lose a job, be left by a spouse, have somebody that you really love die. So very often that in itself can start to have people really begin to look at who they are and what life is about very differently. So, I guess I shy away from saying it is this and it looks like that. So, but I think people have a general sense that something really profound is different now, in a way that if I'm just having a hard time, like my life still feels like it's generally on course and I'm not really questioning myself so much. And I bring all of my resources to bear to problem solve if I'm just having a hard time. Whereas if I'm in this sort of transitionary period, it's like everything's up for grabs.
So why can this happen even when life looks so good on paper? I mean, someone's built a career, they've built a family structure, they have stability, yet they wake up feeling sort of disconnected from it all, from that very life they've worked so hard to build.
Well, I think it doesn't happen for everybody. It's not like everybody gets that opportunity. And I guess I really look at it as an opportunity. I remember in our last podcast, I'd actually posed the question, what if the very worst thing in your life ends up being the best thing that ever happened to you?
I remember that.
So it's some people don't hear the call and some people do. And some people hear the call, but how they respond to it sort of circumvents what might happen or what the potential for this time could bring.
You mentioned that things are so different from person to person, but you referred to the call. What does the call feel like, or where is it coming from in your experience from having worked with so many different individuals? Is it a call from within? Is it a call from without? Is it a voice that you sort of never paid attention to and suddenly it just slams you?
Could be that. I think generally it's a call from within. And I think it usually can be like something that's always kind of been there, but you haven't really paid attention to it. But I really think that it's when we start to get a sense of how I've been living my life, it stops making sense in the same way. And so, although it can often be initiated by outside circumstances change, it really is. I mean, and every individual has a different capacity for this, but it's an opportunity to go a bit deeper with ourselves and to try to make sense of our journey and to figure out what we need to do to move forward in a way that is going to be meaningful and purposeful for us. And that might really put us at odds with what we have accomplished or what we have been doing with ourselves, how we have been living in our life.
I mean, it almost sounds like it's part of the trap that people assume that the problem must be with something right there in front of them, like the marriage or the job or the life they've built. But the deeper crisis may actually be something that fixing those things has no power to change, but something beyond. So what does it actually start to look like and feel like in someone's life, waking up each day?
I think that one thing a lot of people have talked to me about is they start to begin to ask why and what. Like, why am I here? What am I doing? Is this all there is? Is this all I have to look forward to? You know, a lot of times, the first half of our life, we're sort of getting established and developing our ego and just our story of ourself. So it's a really busy time, and we're sort of usually pursuing a goal, whether that's education or a job or career, becoming partner, becoming the head of a division. It's always like we're sort of really on track, and our attention is sort of absorbed in more the external world. We don't really remember that all the influences and people and situations that have helped us sort of form that story of who we are. But very often, if we are lucky enough, something happens where we really have an opportunity to say, is this my life? Is this who I am and who I'm going to be? And some of that is because there may be kind of a division between what our goals have been and who we thought we were supposed to be or who we thought we were, and what really feels unfinished or unaddressed or unknown almost within us. And so that disparity really can provide us with an opportunity to go deeper. Unfortunately, we live in a culture that really bombards us constantly and distracts us and keeps our attention focused outside on all the things that are happening around us and what everybody wants from us and how other people view us and how we are measuring up. And so it's, if we get this opportunity, it gives us a chance to let go of some of that and to look deeper into ourselves. The problem is that our ego doesn't like that. Our ego gets really rattled and It looks for comfort and security and outside approval, external approval. And so sometimes we sort of circumvent this opportunity. There's the whole Hollywood joke about, he runs off with a secretary or he buys a sports car or something. It can just really pull us out of that process and put us back into just doing what we've always done, a bit like rearranging the chairs on the Titanic, but essentially we've got everything the same, but we're just sort of managing different things in our life. We really have a tendency sometimes during this to project all of what we feel isn't working with our life on someone else. So it's on your wife or it's on your job or, where you live or on the political situation. But this isn't something that's going to be solved from the outside in. It really is only addressable from the inside. And once we do address that, the outside things might change, but that's not the origin of our investigation or our curiosity. It's not on how everyone else is disappointing me in my life. It's not how selfish or unkind or unreasonable everyone else is. It really is, what is inside me that is dissatisfied that I am projecting onto everyone else or blaming everyone else for.
It seems like that word ego comes up, and it's important for our listeners to understand that it's not the first three letters of the word egotistical, but it's really that sort of rule book that starts from the beginning of our life that goes on to shape our persona, which is where we find ourselves in that stage of life where that unsettling feeling of inauthenticity sort of starts developing and brewing and fuels that calling. Am I correct in that interpretation?
Well, ego isn't a noun, it's a verb. And so, kind of. Our ego really is a story that we tell ourselves, that we believe about ourselves, who and what we think we are. But it's very restricted and narrow. Certainly our family of origin has a huge impact on it. If you think of the idea of imprinting, our family of origin has a very similar impact on us in terms of beginning to establish our story about who we are. We are much more than our ego, though, of course. Right? That's
sure.
just like the CEO of the company, but it's not the whole company.
So we hear these little voices starting to raise and to clamor a little bit more, and we may choose to even ignore them and just keep on working on our persona and the whole outside manifestation of our plan. But what happens when someone starts ignoring that inner voice that's saying there's something that's not authentic here? There's something about me that's not congruent with my outside picture, my inside picture's uncomfortable. What happens when we ignore that for too long?
Well, it doesn't go away just because we're not willing to attend to it. It has a way of subverting us. It can actually kind of, it gets us it sabotages us here and there throughout our life. Like, we wonder why some of our choices or some of our decisions, you may see like us making the same kind of mistakes over and over and over again. It's interesting because the word karma, people often mistake it to think that, we're going to be punished for something we did, but that's not really the purpose of karma. It is to continue to create an opportunity for us to learn what we haven't learned yet. And so we will put ourselves in a similar position again and again and again until we actually learn what we needed to learn. And I think that's another way to think about a midlife crisis, or even just these patterns that we develop in our life. I mean, we can sit down with people and talk to them. I mean, certainly I do when I'm sitting with somebody. Like, it's never a one-off problem. Like you can see that problem has been reflected again and again and again throughout their life in the relationships, the kind of jobs they have, the circumstances and situations.
Mm-hmm.
You can really see patterns in people's life. And, it is those little voices that rear their little heads seeking attention.
So, and some people it can hit like a really sudden, unmistakable crisis, but in others, it can just sort of have that slow creep and recurring voice and question mark that just sort of follows them through a series of events, if I understand correctly.
Well, the ego really wants to avoid this, this sort of being set aside and having this go deeper. We are the only mammals that can accidentally trigger our fight flight response because of an ego threat. Right? Like you never see a dog going into a panic attack because it's going to be embarrassed or it's going to meet some kind of humiliation or because they have felt humiliated. But we do. Humans do have that response, which I've always found sort of really remarkable and really interesting because it's, within us, there is the capacity to resist going deeper, but at the same time, we're all drawn to go deeper.
I think
If
that's a
we're
really
willing.
important balance between the strength of being drawn and that resistance, which is probably multifactorial and built up with so many different ramparts. So, does
Yeah.
everyone go through some version of a midlife crisis, or maybe it's a midlife reauthentication? I'm not sure. I mean, there's so many ways you could play with the words, but does everyone go through that, or do some people just experience it much more intensely than others? Hence the name crisis.
No, I don't think everybody does go through it. No, I think some people just kind of move along the surface of their life and, you know, um, things seem fine for them. Sometimes they wake up on their deathbed and go, what the hell was that? But some people, they may not be psychologically minded or may have been lucky enough to feel like they found their purpose, that their life is meaningful to them. I think it happens more when we really, it often comes from suffering, or which is really when our life doesn't work or doesn't bring us what we had hoped it would, or doesn't make us feel fulfilled. Um, so, not everybody is lucky enough. Like the people who, find their purpose and their life is meaningful. I can't see any reason why they would go through that. But I think it's usually more when things don't feel like they're lining up for us, or if we've had a lot of suffering. So suffering is always easier to bear if we can find meaning or purpose in it. But that will definitely get our attention.
The crisis of meaning seems to be a very popular term these days, and it seems like there are lots of factors that can detract from that sense of meaning, which can lead to us looking back and sort of wondering what it was all for. Even young people these days, I think there are a lot more high achievers who are feeling a crisis of meaning, I think, than ever before, and enjoying reading Arthur Brooks' most recent release, and as he's really delving into that. So it seems like everyone potentially has the opportunity to do some important questioning midlife, and some, depending on how big that thread is, can certainly enter a crisis. Now, does that process actually differ between men and women? Have you noticed anything different about the midlife?
I'm sure that there are differences, or maybe especially in the cause of the crisis and all the rest of it. But I think, it's funny because I do think that men and women are quite different in my experience and from my work, I would say. But I think that the human experience, when it comes to this, overrides any sort of significant differences. I know, you'll have other people who look at this with a different lens. And so, if I was a doctor, and I might have a lot to say about that in terms of, hormones and all that stuff. But as a psychotherapist, when I have somebody in the chair across from me weeping because they are heartbroken and they have no idea what they're doing or why they're doing it or what they should do next, I don't see a lot of difference. You know, it look from my chair, it looks pretty much the same, regardless of whether it's a man or a woman sitting in front of me. But like I said, if you're talking somebody with a different lens, they probably would say something quite different, and that wouldn't surprise me.
There seems to be a certain universality to that whole sort of migration from the first adulthood to the second adulthood, where suddenly death and our own mortality sort of enters the equation, where we start asking ourselves some real questions. And it's certainly been brought out that, many people know that sort of cultural script that exists today of the so-called midlife crisis. But when they're actually in it themselves, why do they so often just not recognize it until they're suddenly acting out and doing something drastic?
Well, our ego doesn't want us to, really.
Tell us more about that, because I think the ego works really hard to not shake the rule book that has been filled with rules probably from day one since we were born, and it goes through some pretty drastic mechanisms, I guess you could say, when the psyche is just calling out and the soul is calling out.
I don't want to set the ego up as if it's a bad thing, because we certainly need to have a healthy ego so we can function in our daily life. And I don't even think that it's necessarily conspiring against us. Sometimes it just is not aware of what we have forgotten, or what we are unaware of ourselves, what is unconscious to us. And so, yeah, I think that plays a factor in it too. But really, the job of the ego is just to keep things on track and keep it moving and keep things stable and comfortable. We live in a culture that is pretty crazy right now. I mean, it's crazy for everything and everyone. And a lot of the institutions that would have provided stability and meaning and purpose have been really severely undermined. And I don't mean just religion. I mean, trust in our doctors, trust in our governments, trust in our families. Like, a lot of things have taken a big hit lately. So I think it's not surprising to me that this idea of midlife crisis, or crisis in general, has become more salient, because, the stability of the world in general has kind of never been more challenged.
Do you think the challenge is bigger for someone in midlife today compared to someone in midlife in 1960?
It's- Essentially, I think it's the same. But the fact maybe that there are more people might be because of what's been going on. And I mean, I think it works in two ways as well. I mean, I think we have more awareness. Certainly, at one time, if you talked about the unconscious, that would be like a really strange thing to talk about. But it's just part of our everyday speech now. It used to be that people didn't get divorced, and now it's really common, unfortunately. So I think as the solidity around us begins to dissolve, it's not surprising that more people are experiencing it within themselves as well. And there's also, like you said, like, there's a plethora of self-help books and improvement projects that sort of give this idea of making yourself over. I mean, look at the cosmetic industry. It's like the latest thing now is like 70-year-old women having facelifts so they can look like they're 30 or 40, right? So there's this, like, making oneself over is a pretty common concept now, where, people wouldn't have really thought about that before.
I think the one difference that strikes me, and it's sort of echoed in so many elements, and it affects young people growing up, is that the pressure of external validation seems to be bigger than ever versus that true, authentic internal validation of self that only you can assign yourself.
I think most people are dead from the neck down. Right? In terms of their connection to their physical body, aside from it being something that needs to have a makeover. I mean, I don't think people put a lot of weight on their own internal experience. Everything is up on the internet and displayed for the amusement and entertainment of everyone else. We're not really, I don't think we get the concept that what's within is significant, vital, worthy of attention, because you can't put it up. You can't post it. It's not a product that you can barter.
We're going to take a break and be back to this interesting conversation with our guest, Bev Blaney. Stay tuned. Okay, we're back from the break. Hope everybody got a chance to breathe, maybe get a little something to drink. So, Bev, tell me, at its core, is a midlife crisis mainly about the fear we all face with our looming mortality, or is it also about grieving the person we didn't become or the life we thought we would have?
Well, I guess I think about it as an opportunity
Mm-hmm.
to become the person that we wanted to be, but may have been diverted by, the desires of our parents or the work they didn't finish or wanting to be what we think we should be.
I think the mortality notion is just about the awareness of time. And I think, some really smart people have written about that whole notion of when you're a kid, the days seem endless because it seems like time lasts forever. And those great days that you remember in the summertime playing from morning until past dusk were just that perfect framework to understand the magic of that time of life. But as we get older, we realize that there is some time left, but it's not indefinite. And I think that really shapes our awareness that we don't have forever to think about this stuff. And some people will somehow manage to defer or delay or just not think about it at all, whereas others sort of find themselves at that crossroads where they really need to think about it. But what will make someone enter a very deep grieving process as opposed to just sort of saying, okay, I need to make a couple changes to set myself on track? Like grief is to grieve a person in a lifetime is a pretty powerful emotion.
As somebody told me once, that grief is the experience we have when what we hold most precious is ripped from our grasp and beyond our ability to recapture it. So in terms of this, I guess I talk about it differently
Mm-hmm.
because although I think the initial impetus might be shattering or upsetting or difficult or painful or um, for me, I think of it as a really positive thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's funny. I had a man in my office, my studio, several weeks ago who had a very successful career, and most people would have thought that he was like really at the top of the game. And it's like he had awakened to the awareness that none of that mattered to him. And I know some people might have perceived that as a tragedy, but, and certainly, it's important to acknowledge that somebody's going through a hard time. But after validating how difficult it was, I actually told him that I was excited for him and that I thought he was really lucky to have the chance now to be able to to find what was important to him, to live the life that would feel more meaningful to him. And it doesn't disqualify everything that someone has done. And in some ways, that might have been exactly what they needed to do in order to come to the point where they're ready to make a change. So when you talk about grief, it's a little hard for me to relate to it because I think I'm just so pleased for people.
Well, you've always framed it with that optimism that comes with opportunity, but there's also the individual's reaction and the sadness that comes with midlife. And what's that sadness really about?
Well, I think some of it might be because they may be saying they've wasted all their time, or because, in some cases they've lost somebody that they really loved and it wasn't their choice. And they, I've talked to people who have loved their marriage and they love their life. And somebody else has decided that they're not going to continue. And so in those situations, it is forced upon them. And there can be a sadness. And I'm not suggesting that people just vault over whatever suffering they have. I don't think that would be appropriate. But along with that, when they're ready, they do have the opportunity to become more than what they were or something other than they were. So, it's not like I think everybody's going to get up and dance when they lose their job or their husband walks out on them, but it doesn't have to stop at that. They haven't died yet. So
What I struggle with understanding sometimes is if you consider the successful story, or it doesn't have to be the super achiever, but the well achiever or the decently achieved individual deals with this sadness in midlife, but somehow and sometimes it gets turned into just drastic decisions about marriage, the job, or life itself. What steers an individual down a semi-well-adjusted path versus a more drastic path?
It is possible for people to drown in anger and bitterness. That happens. But I guess what drives them? There's things that we haven't talked about yet. People can be stuck for all kinds of reasons. They can be stuck with their parents' trauma that they have internalized and lived by and, haven't really outgrown, haven't left behind. And, if we don't resolve our own issues around that, then we'll just hand it down to our kids. And a lot of people do. Not everybody does. What gives people more resilience? It's a lot of things that can give people resilience. Having some belief in something beyond yourself. I mean, it must be horrifying if you have no belief in anything greater than yourself, if it all comes down to you, and then things go off the rail. That might be pretty bleak. It might be hard to handle. And certainly a lot of people, like our culture is secular these days, pretty much. And so, I think if there's nothing greater than you and it all comes down to you and this life and that afterwards there's nothing, it might be a little bit harder to move on from a great loss.
It seems like all of these questions that arrive in midlife, which can fuel the crisis, often involve some degree of reckoning with the life that someone has built, and where they start to feel, I did what was expected of me, I worked hard, I sacrificed, but now I'm asking, what about me in all of this?
It's always been about them. I mean, I know they might think that and I can understand why they may feel like they've been living someone else's dreams and goals, but they don't seem to be willing to accept responsibility for themselves in the same way. Like, once you're an adult, it's not your father's fault. It's not your mother's fault. It's a big influence. And it may take a while to become mature enough to accept responsibility for how you have been living your life. But at the end of the day, the only way you can really build the life you want is to accept responsibility for yourself and for your choices. That doesn't mean that other things haven't influenced you, because they do, but you have to have a willingness to take on the job for yourself. Otherwise, you're just going to continue to blame everyone else, and those projections are going to be flowing high, wide, and fancy.
I did what I'm expected. Now it's my turn. You can see where that statement can really take over and become also a justification for choices that are so deeply disruptive to one's own life, to the people around them. Is this?
Yeah. And also can be a waste of time, because unless they're really, like, you have to accept responsibility yourself. Otherwise, you're not going to start to look inward to yourself. You're going to still be like trying to fix everything else out there. And people say, oh, it's my life and it's my turn and all of that stuff. It hasn't been anyone else's turn ever. Like, I mean, most marriages are salvageable. Like, there are times when you really do need to leave a spouse. But what I generally see when people leave their spouse is they're not taking that inward journey to find meaning and purpose, and to understand what the influences were on their life and resolve the issues that they confronted as children and later carried out into their relationships with other people. And so that kind of like, I'm going to throw everything out and start again. Again, it doesn't really lead to the inner work that needs to be done to resolve the issues that put you in a place where you were living someone else's dream or following someone else's standards or expectations in the first place. So, very often when somebody leaves their partner about 4 or 5 years later, especially when it's for another partner, they find themselves with the same partner. They just have different hair and, they're taller or shorter or thinner or something. But you will likely see the same issues arising again and again and again in that relationship that you did in the previous one, because that wasn't the problem. It's interesting. I've been studying Terry Real's couple therapy. Probably because I've spent the last 20 years working with doctors, and they have a really difficult time with their relationships, which is really understandable. But it's really brought home to me the fact that most marriages are fine. He says, there's love, the kind of love you have when you first fall in love. It's love without knowledge. And then after many years of being together, you have knowledge and sometimes not much love, or it feels like that. But if you work at the marriage, work at yourself, and work at the relationship, you can return to a point where you have knowledge and love. Yeah. And that really what is happening is that you're unpacking all of the baggage that you brought into a marriage. And hopefully they are doing the same thing as well. And it's through that maturation that you can actually connect with another person in a very deep and meaningful way.
Is that maturation not only a relational maturation, to use a term that Terry Real uses a lot, but is it also that maturation that comes with that stage of your life where you let your true individuality emerge, and in a setting of safe mutual acceptance, each partner can each express their own individuality?
I think it is. Run that by me again, Mark.
So I was just thinking, there's that maturation that occurs with the appropriate questioning, as we've talked about, and then if we give each other space to relationally mature during those times, especially at midlife, that's important. But part of it, and I think back to, some of my readings of James Hollis and other authors, where they talk about that process of individuation, where you part of your love is nurtured by witnessing the individuality of your partner, and having them develop that freely is an act of love in itself, but it also carries its reward of being the observer and seeing that person reach their potential.
I'm not sure that I would think about it that way.
Okay.
I think that we're not expecting the other person to complete us anymore. We're
Right.
not buying into that myth. We're not expecting, we're willing to do the work to become a whole person. And that's not the way love is presented to us in Hollywood or in romance novels. It's always,
Of course not.
I've met my soulmate, and that person is going to complete me in all the ways that I'm lacking. The problem is that the person that we pick may not even have any of those qualities or characteristics that we believe that they did when we were initially attracted to them. We don't realize that we have, in fact, projected all those qualities and characteristics onto that person. And that's what we've fallen in love with. And they can never do that for us. They can never do that. They didn't even
It's too big an ask.
realize it. It's not that it's, no, it's not because it's not because it's because that's not who they were. It's who we wanted them to be. And eventually we will see them as human beings who are as flawed as we are. And in some ways, I think that doesn't mean that we can't have relationships that can support that kind of inner work for ourselves. But one of the reasons why marriages fail now is because we just ask too much of them. Like they can't possibly. And people used to have marriages. It used to be like, for political reasons. It's like we're going to join this kingdom with that kingdom, and together we'll be safer. It's supposed to be this romantic ideal. I think that if we're willing to accept how flawed we are and heal what needs to be healed and see that process happening in another person, that can be very helpful. But I don't think that's what happens in a lot of relationships. I think people just get angry and resentful when that person turns out not to be who we thought they were.
I mean, I've heard Terry, like you said, I've heard Terry Real speak. Even Esther Perel brings it up. The expectations of modern relationships now are so intense and complicated. And by that, I'm not saying that the relationships are, but the expectations are that you imagine facing these expectations and the unmets of midlife, if you will. It could really sort of take things to the next level. So, I mean, with all of that, the damage that can occur during a midlife crisis when someone changes so dramatically, the people around them are just left thinking like, who is this person? Who are you? I don't understand you anymore at all. Is that like the extreme?
So, I think typically when people are talking like that, it's when somebody has, they've left their life, they've left their family, they've left their job, they've bought a boat and they're sailing around the world. And not that that's always a midlife crisis. But definitely the person that they're looking at isn't meeting the roles and expectations that they seem to have very happily existed within. And it's not, I don't think that, if somebody does all that, I'm not sure they're actually doing the work. I think they're, like I said before, just trying to move the chairs around on the Titanic. I think that sometimes they have no idea what is really at the heart of what they need to do. You know, we live in a culture that thinks that anxiety is something that should be avoided at all costs. It's, you know, a sign of a mental illness, or we're not very good with being anxious or uncomfortable. And we're not really willing to sit down and settle into it.
And understand it and what its triggers are and what we
To
can
be
do about it
curious.
ourselves.
Well, really to be curious about it at all. You know, I don't know how many parents brought their kids to me because their kids had anxiety when they had to write a test, like, and felt like there was something really wrong because the kid was anxious. And so, I mean, there's a point where anxiety can become dysfunctional for people. So I'm not trying to suggest that, but there's very little tolerance for any discomfort at all in our culture, and we don't like it. So that, you know, to conspire to make it something to be avoided.
Which can then just ramp up the anxiety response even further with the next wave of challenges, if I understand correctly.
Well, for sure, but it also, like, where do we grow? We grow outside our comfort zone. So if you're not willing to be uncomfortable, guess what? You're never going to grow.
By midlife, death and dependency are no longer distant ideas, and well, they could be a source of anxiety. They're a source of all kind of other different thoughts. And we may have raised our children. We're now looking at our partner's health. We're looking at our aging parents, or even our own vulnerability. How do those realities even amplify the midlife crisis further? Like if we are at that point where we're asking questions of ourselves, yet we're facing our partner's health issues, our aging parents, the call to caregive, the needs of others, and then we enter this sort of imbalance where we're trying to re-explore the self and the parts of us that perhaps have been let aside, yet we're called in and pulled in more to give and to nurture others. You can see where you sort of hit that breaking point where you almost would feel, how do I do this with so many competing priorities?
In some ways, I wonder if they've ever really taken care of themselves, if they haven't really done any of that interior work, or if they've never heard a call to do it. So I think it would be very difficult to try to support somebody in their dying process if you haven't even really invested in your own living process. Um, I think it, can be really difficult. Interestingly to me, I find people really separate their life up into compartments. It's like, this is my work life, and this is my private home time, and then this is me time. And it's like these are all separate things instead of thinking about, I'm living my life. So I would kind of think about, we've talked before in the last episode about doctors having to balance work life and, their private life. And I've always felt like that was a really strange way to divide up a human being. And for me, it really is more like a Mobius where, hopefully I'm doing work that I care about and am connected to and want to do and find meaningfully important. And so for me, like, I don't change persona when I move from being a therapist to being a partner, being on my own in my garden. It's not such an abrupt transition. And so often when I'm working in the garden, I'm thinking about clients that I see. And it does flow together in a way that is not unpleasant or difficult for me. But I don't know that everybody allows themselves to find their vocation, and they get stuck with that job that they don't even necessarily like and don't feel is significant or important to them. And so if they're doing it's like they're doing it for money. And I want to be respectful because I know, we can all end up in a place where we have to pay the bills and we have to pay the mortgage, but we didn't start out there. I'm not sure how well we're supported to find a vocation instead of a career. But I'm convinced that if we supported our kids to find their vocation, that they wouldn't be struggling so much with, like, I have to take care of my parents or I have to take care of my wife. I think there would be more of a flow. And I think that the transitions between those wouldn't be as abrupt. And for me, I guess whatever moment I am in holds purpose and meaningful to me. And so I'm curious about it. Like, sometimes people talk about taking care of their aging parent as, a burden. And I understand it takes resources and time and energy, but this could be as much of their life, meaningful life, as anything else they're doing. It's like, okay, like this person that you're with is maybe closer to death than you are. What are they going to teach you? Well, instead of thinking that there's something else or somewhere else I should be that would be more meaningful, it's like, no, this is my life right now. I'm with this human being. And am I here? Am I present with them? I think that way, it's like there's something in this for you.
Mm-hmm.
Why and what has brought this moment into your life the way it is? And what can you learn from it right now? I think when we separate our life up, when we chop our life up, this is mine and that's somebody else's, and this is, I think we lose that connectedness that we have in the moments that we're occupying, that we're in, that would make whatever we're doing easier to do because it's about us. Like, why is it that I am the only person in my family of, 10 people who will sit with my mother while she dies? Like, why is that? What were the relationships and the connections within the whole family that resulted in this outcome? Now, maybe as you ponder that, you'll discover things that say, oh, I wasn't really living my life the way I wanted to. Or maybe you'll say, no, this is exactly what I want to do. But if you assume that it shouldn't be happening, that was someone else's job and they're reneging or, not being fair, then you're not going to get that piece. And I know there's lots of families where one person gets stuck with most of the caregiving or whatever, and other people have very little interest or willingness to participate in that. But it's not necessarily a burden to you. It could be a great teacher. And if you can relax into it, maybe it doesn't have to be so difficult or demanding or stressful. Maybe there's nowhere else you should be. Maybe there is, but maybe there isn't.
I always learn so much from our discussions, and something that really echoes today that you're telling me is that notion of having fluidity and bringing the most authentic version of yourself to every domain or every dimension of your life, as opposed to bringing a certain part of you here or a certain part of you there or a certain part of you to the caregiving scenario, certain part of you to the job, certain part to the family. And that sort of fluidity allows for that authentic person that is you to get the most meaning of all of your experiences in those different locations or spaces or moments. That really hits home and is certainly good fuel for reflection. I think we could be a lot happier if our authentic selves showed up consistently.
I don't want to diminish or dismiss that it doesn't take time and energy, and it might be hard. It may be logistically
Exhausting.
hard.
Yep.
Well, I think it's less exhausting though. If you, I think it can be less exhausting if you really feel like this is meaningful to me. And why is it? Is it because I'm learning that I need to live my life differently? Or is it learning that affirms the choices I've made? But I
And
think that's important.
yeah,
Either
I think
way, you're going to learn.
it was really echoed in a kind of a comment Jeanette Yates made on the podcast some time ago, where she said, there came a time where I just wanted to spend time with mom as her daughter and as in that relationship and just be that person in the room with my mom. And that really, I think, echoes that same sentiment of being there to learn from the moment and to be in the moment.
My mother was a wonderful woman, but she was never more magnificent than in her dying. And she taught me so much through that. Like, she was extraordinary. Her whole family was around her, and she was laughing and making jokes. And she was fully aware that she was dying and leaving us. It does make me wonder with people who are choosing to have mates, and I'm worried for them. Uh, I don't mean to sound arrogant, I really don't. But there's so much to be learned in the dying for the living that sometimes wanting to be in charge of that and decide when and where and how, I think some of that might be lost. And I have no idea if and when I face that I don't know what I'll do. But, when I was near the end of my cancer treatment, um, I had a lot of damage from radiation, and it was really painful. And I kind of reached a point where I thought, okay, I've had enough. Like, I've had enough of this. And I was pretty ready to let go. And my youngest daughter was there. And she must have realized that I was kind of had enough. And she laid down beside me and she cupped my face in her hands. And she looked very deeply into my eyes. And she said, I see you. I know you. Please stay.
We're going to take a short break and be back soon to pursue this journey, today's discussion. Folks, we're back from the break. We're here with Bev Blaney, exploring the journey that is the midlife crisis. So, Bev, tell me a little bit about your thoughts about what happens when we're facing that midlife period of questioning, the so-called crisis. But as a person, we're still needed everywhere else in our life, by our children, by our partner, by our parents, their family. I mean, what gives when the crisis collides with responsibility?
I think there's different ways to think about this crisis in a way. It's like, it's a time where we can be more present for other people than we ever have. So when I told the story about my daughter, um, that was a crisis, for her and I. So it doesn't mean that you have to be less present for other people. In some ways, you could be more present than you ever have been. I think that we think about a midlife crisis as something that we go towards, um, into, and then somehow we're on the other side. And I don't think it actually is like that. I think that it really is sort of like the turn of the wheel. We're still, we still are who we were, but how we are looks different, and how we occupy our life may look different. For some people, it might be the most intimate experience they've ever had with themselves, because it's like they're all up in their face and they can't get away from themselves. And very often, people choose never to confront themselves, to be with themselves. Some people can't even spend a rainy afternoon by themselves. They constantly need to be distracted, or to have, you know, to put some distance between how they live their lives and how they feel inside. But I can't think of a greater gift that you could bring to somebody than to actually be with them honestly and openly. It does require vulnerability, but um, it's such an enriched experience both for yourself and for the other person. When my daughter looked into my face and told me she loved me and wanted me to stay, I mean, she was caring for me, yes, but there was no question about that meeting of two souls.
Hmm.
I can't think of anything richer
You're right.
that we can have as a human being than to make honest, genuine contact, heart to heart contact with another person. So, the question you asked me was like about managing all these different things. I guess I don't know that we have to manage it. I think we could let it flow.
We hear so much these days about caregiver burnout, the demands of caregiving across all kind of different formats. But when we're in midlife and going through this period of self-questioning, under what conditions does caregiving actually become soul aligned? And like, when does it become self-erasure? What's that line in between, that line in the sand?
I think when we're doing it and we don't want to do it and we can't see any meaning behind duty or obligation, I think it's harder. And I don't want to sound critical of other people. I mean, these are really difficult transitions that everybody has to manage or experience. And I'm sure it's hard, but I think if there's somewhere else or something else that we feel like we are sacrificing in order to be there or do it, then I think it's harder.
Mhm.
Um,
Heather Gray recently mentioned when she visited with us that while you may accept your call to caregiver, you do have a role in defining how you show up and what the definition of your role is, and that some you just are unable to do. And I think it points towards that sort of authentically showing up. And then, as you well point out, that some of it may not be within the realm of what fits, and that can be handled differently through different avenues.
I think that, like I said before, the lens that we're viewing this through is really important and is really going to impact the discourse, and probably appropriately so. And so maybe there isn't one right way to do this, but I think if you can allow yourself to be open and honest and not just following a prescribed script, that you would have the opportunity to figure out what is authentic or reasonable or valid for you to do. And I don't think it is going to look the same for all people, or that it should. And I think, to the extent that you have already done some of your own work, then it's going to be easier for you to do that in the face of all the demands that you're facing if you're trying to take care of somebody who once took care of you.
I think some people really start checking out of the roles they've already built, not always by physically distancing or leaving, but also by emotionally vacating those roles. What kind of damage can that do to the individual and their relationships?
Oh, I think I think it's heartbreaking for them and for people around them. Um, it's a real missed opportunity for everyone. I guess if I go through what have seen in terms of people I've worked with, give you sort of a flavor of how midlife crisis can unfold. I was working with somebody. I was working with a man who had a very successful career and had, from the outward, it would have been like considered an ideal life and beautiful wife, beautiful kids, and had experienced a sense of, well, first it started with burnout, but that seemed to kind of resolve itself or at least appeared to. And, it's interesting because when you work with people, you're not watching it, the whole arc of how someone traverses a midlife crisis. So, you only get a glimpse here and there, and it might not even be every week. But my next sort of installment was finding out that they were in love with someone else, and they did leave their marriage, and I think that felt like the right move at the time for that person. But I had this whole backstory that I was holding about this individual, and I had it because they told me about it. But they told me a story of always having been estranged from their father, and their father was an alcoholic, but it wasn't openly acknowledged. And so they had I would describe it as an absent father because they were essentially, and they were physically there, but never really met this child's needs or young person's needs. And so for me, what I'm left holding is when that they left their marriage, they left their children with their mother. There were three young men, young boys. And I was struck by the similarity of that pattern. So that now these young men had an absent father. And it's at a stage of their life where they really needed their dad. Like they're moving out into the world and they don't have their dad. And it was such a remarkable parallel to me about how they had not been validated, loved, accepted by their father. And their father had used the bottle. But now in this person's life, again, these young men had lost their father, but instead of a bottle, it was a mistress. And it's not about judging the person, but it's about seeing how these patterns can arc across generations. And I wonder how these young men are going to fill that father wound for themselves. And I think that happens again and again and again. I think I can totally understand how it would look like a perfect solution in a way, because, all the enthrallment of a new relationship with somebody that seemed perfect. I mean, I can totally sympathize and understand why that would look like the solution. But from my position, what I saw happening was that pain and that wound being handed down. And I wonder, are those boys going to have the courage to, whenever it happens for them, are they going to have the courage to turn around and face that wound, that father wound, and address the heartache that they have? I mean, my client had that same heartache. It was like a really wonderful person. And I think to some extent they did address it and they did try to work with it. But I think there was maybe a bit more work that might have been done so that his sons didn't get it.
We talk about generational trauma, and there's some amazing work out there. I think coming to mind, Mark Wolin and the book It Didn't Start With You, and of course Terry Reel's book, I Don't Want to Talk About It.
It doesn't start for anyone. We all have generational trauma, including our parents. Right?
Absolutely. And I mean, so much of healing these days revolves around acknowledging that they did the best they could. And while it may not be perfect and may have left some damage, that at least allows some sort of reconciliation, if you will. But do you think that the patterns of midlife crises are generational also?
Yeah, for the most part, I do. I think I think it starts with the unmet needs of the child.
So
Like I
not every,
said, we
yeah,
kind of imprint on our parents, right? And we take in all of their issues and worries and concerns and hopes and desires. And if they haven't done their work, where's it going to go? Except onto us. And, we can love our parents and appreciate what they've done for us and respect what they provided us with. But, some parents are better at living their own dreams than others. And when they don't, we inherit them. It
not
really is that collision between how we have been living our life and what our soul called us to that crisis is about.
the
Right?
tension. Hmm.
So, what are the things that contribute to us not living the life we're called to? Limitations of our parents, of our situations, of our culture, of ourself.
Not every marriage or job or identity crisis in midlife is imagined. I mean, our conversation points to the reality and the palpability of it all. But how do people know when change is truly needed or when they're just using change to actually avoid the deeper work?
Well, think if um, I never think an affair is a solution to anything. It's a distraction. In the same way that an addiction would be a distraction or anything that we reach out to as a solution to what is going on inside us. I mean, we haven't done the work. We've
So,
avoided it.
so what are people hoping an affair or a divorce or a reinvention of self, so to speak, or a dramatic life change will finally solve inside of them?
The emptiness of that they're experiencing, whether it's, they haven't accomplished what they wanted to accomplish or they haven't become the person they feel like they should be.
Informed by their own self awareness or informed by the persona they were expected to have? Who's talking here, the ego or the soul?
The soul's talking, it's the soul's calling, the soul's inviting, the ego is resisting.
So, Bev, when someone feels the urge to blow everything up during midlife crisis, how do they pause long enough to tell the difference between a real need for change and just what turns out to be a reactive decision in crisis?
We talk about the critical moment a lot. Therapists talk about the, the critical moment. And it's that moment between stimulus and response.
Hmm.
Because there is a moment, right? Like it's like something happens, and you feel like you really got to do, da, 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 da. But it takes a second to go from that to doing something, right? And I guess for me, the bigger the issue, the longer I want that pause to be. So if it's something that's insignificant, you know, pause doesn't have to be very long. But the more significant this is going to be for myself, for the people that I do love or have loved, I just want that pause to be as long as I can possibly make it. Because in that pause, that's where my real freedom and power is. And the more important something is, the more time I want to really sit with what I'm thinking and feeling before I jump to some kind of solution. Because when we are initially triggered by something, we always want to do something. But the purpose of whatever that behavior is not to do what's in our best interest or our long term interest. It's really intended just to help us deal with the emotions that were activated by that situation. So, very often, what we do to feel better in the moment actually makes things much worse. So, if you feel upset about something, You really want to take some time between what has happened and what you're feeling before you jump into a behavior. And like I said, the more important it is, the longer you want that pause to be, so that you're not just reacting, that you can truly make a response. And so in that moment, you're really savoring what is going on here, what is happening. And if you could actually sit down with somebody who's impartial and talk about it, you can get another perspective on it, because you may have very little perspective because your emotions are overwhelming you and you can't think clearly. When our fight flight is activated, there is less blood flow to the prefrontal cortex.
Mm-hmm.
We're all up in the limbic system, and that's not the most evolved part of our brain. And so if we can actually settle down and calm down, then we get more blood flow to the prefrontal cortex, and that's where all our executive functioning and our most evolved part of our brain is. So we're more likely to come up with a better solution, and it's more likely to be a response. So I really encourage people to try to stretch out the critical moment between stimulus and response. Everybody, well, not everybody knows, but Viktor Frankl always said, between stimulus and response, there is a moment, and in that moment lies our freedom. If we are just habitually responding from programs that we have acquired as children, if we're responding from solutions that we developed as children, which might have suited that situation very well. And thank goodness we were clever enough to come up with a response, a creative adjustment, a solution as
The
children.
adaptive child, so to speak.
Absolutely. It let us survive. But we're not children. We're now adults, and we have way more resources than those children had. But their solutions are the ones that are probably going to be triggered when we're upset, because they were the earliest ones. So stretching out that critical moment allows us to know that we've been upset, might allow us some opportunity to recall that this is familiar, this has happened before, this feels like when I was 5 or whatever. But guess what? I'm not 5 now. I can do X, Y, and Z. And so, maybe what I was doing as a child, although it was adaptive then, is maladaptive now, or there could be better solutions now. So if I will let myself take the time to calm down, or if I can talk to somebody else, they may be able to help me look at alternative ones.
What are the big decisions, the obvious, but even from your experience, the not so obvious big decisions that someone should really be careful about making in the middle of this midlife crisis?
Quitting your job, spending a lot of cash, leaving your wife, taking a mistress. I guess those would be the top 4 that I would say. I mean, those are the ones that I see most often when people are making a jump. Your life might be absolutely fine, or at least workable or salvageable, but maybe you don't need to totally remake yourself. Maybe you could make renovations and you would still be happy, or could work towards feeling happier, including some of the things that you left behind that you wish you hadn't.
So before we wrap up today, if someone wants to move and navigate through the midlife crisis in a healthy way without blowing up their life, what does that actually look like?
A prescription? How to navigate that?
No,
I think it's great.
I would think more
ideas.
of I'm thinking more an impression. So let's be impressionistic and not prescribed.
How have let me be more personal, because how have I moved through the transitions in my life that were challenging? I feel like I've had my ego unraveled on a pretty regular basis, which has been a really good thing for me. Um, I think being aware that you're facing something that is large in your life is really important. I think that clearing out some space and some time, if you can take some time off work or have less piled up on your plate, sometimes it only takes an afternoon, but you need some time alone with yourself without distractions, and you need to listen to yourself. So I would journal, I would write, evoking a lot of curiosity. Why this? Why here? Why now? Do I feel called towards anything? And
What
then
is
from there, talking, hearing your own voice in your own ear, talking to a therapist or a friend. Sometimes you just need to hear what you're saying out loud and be like, whoa, I didn't follow that.
hmm,
Um, and
what
then
is that?
from there, very gently and slowly moving forward and making small changes. I'm not somebody that would blow everything up. And sometimes things are taken away from you. And so your life is going to be transformed in a larger way. But even then, I think going slow is really what's important, and listening to yourself and believing that there's wisdom in here and that you do know what you need, because you do. If you're willing to listen instead of coming up with all the reasons why it's not possible or why it's not practical, or, like, you can make anything happen, but the scale might need to be smaller.
So, for those people listening today, what does this process truly ask of them? Is it the ability to listen honestly to oneself?
It requires them being uncomfortable,
Hmm. Back to the
um,
discomfort. Hmm.
for sure. It requires them maybe feeling afraid, being uncertain. It requires curiosity and trust, and being gentle and compassionate with yourself, and not expecting, you know, being okay with change. This is who I have been. I've outgrown it. This is what I could be.
If someone moves through this midlife crisis instead of just reacting to it, but moves through it, what can life look like on the other side?
The best. um, our lives can be so expanded and joyful and meaningful and satisfying and fun, instead of being painful and dreary and just nasty. It's always worth it, to me. And I think it is worth it, or I wouldn't say that. You have a chance to, we have the opportunity to live until we die. We don't have to just exist until we fall over. And as far as we know, I mean, if you're Buddhist, you might believe in reincarnation, but you don't come back as the same person.
Right.
So this is like this one opportunity, like, and like, why not enjoy it? I'm not going to be here forever, but like, why not really suck the juice out of what can be? And I don't need to worry about dying, because that's going to take care of itself. But until I take my last breath, I'm going to live right up to the last moment, because
Hmm.
why not? I'll
Well,
be dead for a long time.
I'd love our listeners to hear it coming from you, but can a midlife crisis become a turning point instead of just a breakdown?
Oh gosh, the breakdown isn't the whole point. That's what just started the game going. Like, like, it's nothing's broken. Nothing's broken. Things have evolved and changed. It's like everything is still viable, and you might be so much happier and have a richness in your life that you never thought was possible if you allow yourself to have that. Like I said, your ego is not all of who you are. And the self isn't a noun, it's a verb. So we're always selfing if we let ourselves.
I wanted to thank you for coming back to visit with us today. It's been such an enthralling, meaningful conversation. It's been personal. It's been authentic. You came to this conversation as your true self, and we appreciate it. Folks, that wraps up today's episode of the Caregivers podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mark, and we'll see you again next week. Bev, thank you. This was a really rich and important conversation. Midlife crisis is one of those phrases people think they understand, but as we've explored today, it often carries something much deeper: grief, fear, disillusionment, and the pressure of realizing that time is not endless. But what I appreciate in this conversation today is the reminder that this period of life does not have to be defined by chaos or collapse. It can also be a moment of reckoning that leads to clarity, humility, and a different way of moving forward. Before we wrap up, I wanted to remind you of something important. The conversations you hear on this podcast are here to inform, to support, to spark reflection. They're not a substitute for professional medical advice, care, therapy, or crisis services. Listening to this podcast does not create a doctor-patient or caregiver-client relationship between us. If you're facing a medical concern, health challenge, a mental health challenge, or a caregiving situation that needs guidance, I encourage you to reach out to a qualified professional who knows your story. If you're ever in crisis, please don't wait. Call your local emergency number or recognize crisis hotline right away. You deserve real-time help and support. The views you hear on this show, whether from me or my guests, are our own. They don't necessarily reflect any organizations we work with, or are part of, or have worked with, or been part of in the past. This podcast is an independent production. It's not tied to any hospital, university, or healthcare system. Thank you for being here, for listening, and most of all, for taking the time to care for yourself while you continue to care for others. I look forward to hearing from you.